Oftentimes in Angular, when we think of our router configuration, we think about static segments and static parameters, and then we use those parameters to render particular components. But what happens when we have an arbitrary collection of data that we want to identify within our route? So for example, here I have movies, and those movies contain categories, and those categories contain both other movies and other categories, and we end up with this sort of arbitrary nesting of data. Now, because we don't necessarily have a static set of groups here that we can identify, what we can really only do is use the traversal down through this tree of data as a means to identify the section of this data tree that we want to render in a particular application. Now, it's nice to be able to move as much state into our URL as possible, because that ultimately makes every view of the application more shareable and more usable within a team context. So to be able to move something like identifying the with Tom Hanks category of this data tree in the URL, what we can end up using is a wildcard route that allows us to map arbitrary URLs onto a particular component and then a particular view state. So to see what I mean, let's take a look at our app module here. And you can see that I have a componentless path for Go. And then inside of the Go path, I am using the wildcard or the sync route. And essentially what that's going to do is it's going to trap everything after the Go segment, and it's going to map it onto this Go tree component. Then we can use the activated route to identify which URL segments have been trapped by this wildcard. So first, let's just take a look at the browser to see what I'm talking about. So here is our Go segment, and here you can see that it identifies the first part of our tree. And if we jump back over into our tree, you can see here is the top level Go. And then if we click into the movies, what we'll see is action, adventure, rom-com, and sci-fi. And in fact, in the browser, we jump here, and you see that we have action, adventure, rom-com, and sci-fi, and you can see that I go into rom-com. And as I'm doing this, what you'll see is that the URL after the Go segment is being updated to match our traversal down through this data tree. Now again, we don't know what these segments are going to be ahead of time, so we can't configure them in a static way inside of our Angular router, which is why we're using the wildcard or the sync route to capture everything after the Go. And in fact, I can keep going down through here, and you can see that the URL continues to be updated, and we can jump back up through the traversal. And what we're doing is allowing every view and view state for this component to be mapped in the URL. So if I refresh and I'm in the Meg Ryan category, you can barely even see that it's refreshing. I'll show you the network activity. If I refresh, there you go. You can see that we're still in the Meg Ryan category because the traversal down through movies, rom-com, Meg Ryan are all captured in that URL state. And again, we can travel up back through this. So let's jump into the code and see how this is actually working. So here's our tree data, which is just defined as a top level item in this module. And what we're going to do inside of our Go tree component is we're going to first, I'm just mapping the tree data onto something that has a URL encoded path. So essentially when I click on this action adventure, which has a slash in it, you'll see that the slash doesn't represent a segment, or it doesn't represent a segment delimiter. It's actually encoded as part of a single segment within the URL. But ultimately what we want to do is look at the ng on init, where we see that we take the activated route, the URL, and we subscribe to changes in that URL. Now that URL is essentially going to represent all of the segments after Go, which is the root of our wildcard. So every time anything below Go changes, we're going to get that URL event triggered, and then we're going to take each one of these segments and essentially pluck out the path portion. So the URL represents both path and parameters. We don't have any parameters in this case, so I'm plucking out the path. Then we're going to get the individual path items, or we're going to call render tree, and if we jump down to that, what you can see is that I take that collection of path segments, this collection of names, and I'm going to use it to locate the context ID. Now the context ID is essentially us iterating through the names or the portions of the segment. So if you can imagine that when this URL changes, the segments are movies, action and adventure, let's say Tom Cruise. So then here, I'm going to iterate over movies, action, adventure, Tom Cruise, and for each step in that tree traversal, I'm going to find the item at that point in the traversal that's of type group and has the given name. So first I'm going to find action adventure, then within action adventure I'm going to find Tom Cruise, right? So then we can return the parent ID, and then at that point it's as easy as just filtering the data based on the parent ID and the type. Now, the specific implementation details of this demo aren't really the point here. I tried to balance, of course, the complexity and the desire to try and make it somewhat consumable for a simple demo. The real goal here is just to demonstrate that we can use this wildcard route, right, inside of our route configuration. We can use the wildcard route to essentially sync all segments after a particular path, map those onto a particular Angular component, and then use the state of the URL to drive both the component that's being rendered and the view state within that component. And that to me is kind of exciting. Now, in this particular case, and let's be fair, because the data in this tree is ID driven, we're generating IDs on the fly as we build the tree. You could always do something like have you could have a context ID in here, right? And theoretically, as you navigate down to the URL, we could just change the context ID and then find that item within the data tree and then work backwards to develop the breadcrumbs. That's totally possible. But not all data can be identified via an ID, and not all data is unique, right? I could have, say, a Tom Cruise category nested inside other categories within the tree, and there's no way that I could identify Tom Cruise as a unique identifier except for at a particular path within our data tree. So there are going to be times when it's not easy to identify a view state based on a single parameter. And in such cases, it's exciting to be able to, in the Angular router, be able to map an arbitrarily long URL onto a single component and then use the segments of that arbitrary URL as a way to traverse data in the view state. So anyway, the Angular router, I find it to be very, very powerful, and it really does allow us to move a lot more of our application state into the URL, which again makes the application more shareable and more consumable, especially within team context. And that ultimately makes it easier for the user.